The Western Allies faced a time of profound crisis by the summer of 1940. The Nazi blitzkrieg had overrun without much difficulty Poland, Denmark, Norway, Luxembourg, Belgium, the Netherlands, and most notably France. The Germans had never enjoyed such rapid successes during the First World War on the Western Front. Great Britain now stood alone among major Western powers against Nazi militarism. The key strategic advantage that Britain held was that it was an island, and thus it could not be invaded without an aggressor conducting a highly complex and risky amphibious invasion. Many Britons did anticipate an invasion in late 1940, however, and not a few were willing to agree to surrender terms with the Nazis to prevent a large loss of life and the destruction of their island home. Winston Churchill was one of the few, and certainly the most resolute voice in Britain, however, condemning a surrender to the Nazis and calling for Britons to stand firm and stay in the war. Churchill was one of the key figures of the war, and thus his career is important to consider. Churchill came from the Marlborough line of Britons, which featured a long line of heroic generals and politicians. From an early age, he too aspired to be a military hero and a soldier, even predicting as a teenager that one day he would help save London from destruction. Churchill's father was a member of Parliament, who had secured Burma for the British Empire, and his mother was an American. Always eager for action and military glory, Churchill saw combat in Spanish Cuba, India, and at the Battle of Omdurman against the Sudanese, and against the Dutch during Britain's Boer War in South Africa. During the Boer War, Churchill had been taken prisoner, but managed successfully to escape a Dutch prisoner of war camp. He made his way back to British lines, and at an early age, already making a name for himself. Churchill returned to Britain, where he was elected to Parliament for the first time at the age of 25. He was a member of the Conservative Party, like his father. Disputes with the Conservative government, however, led him to cross the floor and join the Liberal Party. When the Liberals won the next general election, Churchill was invited to become a member of the government. Churchill was appointed as the Lord of the Admiralty in 1911 to oversee the Royal Navy. He championed the expansion and modernization of the Navy, which proved timely upon Britain's entry into World War I in 1914. Ironically, it was as Lord of the Admiralty, in charge of the Navy, that Churchill commissioned the construction of the first tracked armored vehicle that would become known as the tank. Churchill was interested in helping the Army break through the trenches and barbed wire of the Western Front, and his tank would eventually be instrumental in breaking the stalemate for the Allies during the First World War. Churchill's time at the Admiralty would come to an end, however, after launching the controversial and disastrous Gallipoli campaign. Churchill envisioned a large amphibious assault landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula, which would proceed to invade Europe through Turkey around the trenches of the Western Front. The expedition was a disaster. British, Australian, and New Zealand troops were pinned down and slaughtered on the landing beaches and never took much ground on the peninsula. In an embarrassing reversal, the British forces were forced to retreat from the peninsula after suffering staggering casualties. The embarrassment of the Gallipoli campaign led to Churchill's removal as First Lord of the Admiralty. He volunteered for military service and commanded the 6th Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers on the Western Front. Churchill demonstrated consistent bravery as the battalion was continually shelled. On multiple occasions, Churchill narrowly escaped death on the front. Churchill returned to Parliament after his military service in World War I, and during the interwar years served in a multitude of roles in the government, including Secretary of State for War and Air, Secretary of State for the Colonies, and Chancellor of the Exchequer. He also wrote an extensive number of works on history, becoming the most published historian in history. Although a fellow member of the Conservative Party with Prime Minister Chamberlain, Churchill continued to react with alarm to the emerging threat that Hitler and the Nazis played to the prevalence of peace in Europe. At times, in fact, Churchill was almost the sole voice in the government warning of Hitler's aggressive plans. Chamberlain and most of his supporters instead favored a policy of appeasement towards Hitler and giving in to the dictator to avoid another war. Churchill had no faith in such a policy. When Hitler invaded Poland and then Western Europe, Churchill's warnings proved correct, and Chamberlain's appeasement led to his downfall. Chamberlain resigned as prime minister, and Churchill became party leader and prime minister instead. Churchill's premiership represented a stark break with his predecessor. Whereas Chamberlain looked to appease Hitler, Churchill looked to defy him. Almost single-handedly, Churchill rallied the spirit of the British people to defy Hitler, continue fighting, and refuse to give in. His wartime speeches during Britain's darkest days during the war were masterpieces of rhetoric and patriotism delivered over the radio by the Prime Minister. In an address on May 13, 1940, Churchill defiantly declared, "I would say to the House as I say to those who have joined this government, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering. You ask what is our policy. I will say, it is to wage war, by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny, never surpassed in the dark and lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask what is our aim. I can answer in one word, victory. Victory at all cost. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival." Commenting on the deteriorating situation on the continent with further Nazi expansion, Churchill addressed the nation again on June 4, 1940, declaring, "Even though large tracts of Europe and many old and famous states have fallen or may fall into the grip of the Gestapo and all the odious apparatus of Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We will fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." And once again on June 18, 1940, "The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life, and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be freed, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will say, this was their finest hour." Churchill's rousing speeches were essential because it was against Britain that Hitler next turned his attention in the summer of 1940. The German Luftwaffe launched a systematic campaign to bomb England into submission and drive her into surrender by terror from the air. Many British cities such as London, Bristol, Manchester, and others were raided and airfields targeted to soften up England for an invasion. The systematic bombing of British cities became known as the Blitz. For much of 1940 and 1941, urban residents were subjected to frequent explosions and fires throughout their cities that threatened to consume historic buildings and neighborhoods. Often without warning or only an air raid siren to give a moment's notice, a Luftwaffe bomber would appear in the sky that would then rain death from the sky above. The Germans also employed a new type of weapon during the Blitz that proved particularly destructive and lethal. V-1 and V-2 rockets, the V standing for Vengeance Weapon, were launched from the continent, often in Nazi-occupied territories, and targeted British cities. This was the first effective use of rocket technology in world history. Londoners often nicknamed them buzz bombs for the loud motor sounds the rockets emitted before they struck their target. V-weapons killed approximately 18,000 people during World War II in British and continental cities and represented one of the most significant technological developments during the war. Thousands of London residents retreated to the countryside to go live with friends, families, or strangers. Many more remained in London and would retreat to even the subway tunnels, which acted as makeshift bomb shelters. The dockyards of London were particularly targeted by the Germans in an effort to disrupt the chain of supply and impair any further war effort by England. London firefighters struggled to contain the blazes, often placing themselves at great risk to flying shrapnel or collapsing buildings to prevent the entire conflagration of the city. As a significant industrial and port city, Liverpool was also targeted and faced massive destruction. Over 4,000 residents of Liverpool perished in the bombing, making the city second only to London for destruction and loss of life. Over 40,000 Londoners perished during the Blitz. Even though some historic sites such as the Tower of London, St. Paul's Cathedral, and Buckingham Palace suffered damage, they were spared destruction and remained large structures symbolizing Britain's defiance. The campaign to defeat the German air bombardment and preserve England became known as the Battle of Britain. The air campaign was fought over the English Channel and British soil. The success of Hitler's campaign to bomb England would determine when he would launch Operation Sea Lion, the campaign to invade England with ground forces. British success depended on the effectiveness of the pilots of the Royal Air Force, RAF, in thwarting the Luftwaffe's aerial campaign. German squadrons of Heinkel bombers would cross the Channel and then target British cities while being covered by Messerschmitt fighters. The Royal Air Force counteracted the Luftwaffe with RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes. The Spitfire was a high-performance interceptor fighter that outperformed the Messerschmitts, and the RAF Hurricanes inflicted 60% of the losses the Luftwaffe suffered during the Battle of Britain. The British efforts during the Battle of Britain were aided by the first widespread use of radar during warfare. Several nations had developed early warning and tracking systems in the 1930s, but they were only being perfected in the early 1940s. Germany and Britain both had systems, but radar was used more effectively by the British during the Battle of Britain, and the RAF was the first air force in the world to fully integrate radar detection with pilots. The tremendous aircraft production of the British, which replaced damaged or downed planes, the skill of the RAF pilots, and the effective use of radar all contributed to the defeat of the Germans during the Battle of Britain. Estimates of the kill ratio for British planes against German planes range from 2-to-1 or 3-to-1. Hitler was forced to delay Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, and then never launched it at all. Even while standing alone, Britain was able to halt the Nazi advance and remain in the war until the tide of victory could be turned. Even as Britain fought in the air to protect the homeland, the nation faced the equally daunting task of fighting the Germans at sea. The Battle of the Atlantic was the protracted war in the Atlantic Ocean between the German and British fleets. German U-boats ravaged the British shipping convoys that kept Britain supplied, and the British Navy struggled to destroy the U-boats and protect its own fleet. Although not yet entered into the war, the United States was a foremost supplier to Britain of food, raw materials, and increasingly military hardware. The destruction of these supply ships made British conditions even more difficult during the war. The British did catch a key break early in the war, which would prove essential for later victory. German coding machines known as an Enigma Machine was captured from disabled German U-boats. A coded message sent on an Enigma machine was indecipherable except through use of another Enigma machine. but the machines were considered unbreakable. A brilliant Polish mathematician, Marian Rejewski, successfully deciphered and recreated the machines, providing British intelligence officials with a tremendous advantage through the course of the war. Ultra became the code name for the British intelligence operation that successfully read a large portion of German encoded transmissions and gave the Allies an immense strategic advantage during the course of the war. The combined secret intelligence operation of Ultra was housed at an English country house in Buckinghamshire named Bletchley Park. Bletchley was probably the most secretive location in England during the war, with a multitude of ciphers and cryptologists working to decode German transmissions and then providing accurate intelligence to British war strategists. Some of the most significant work conducted at Bletchley Park was conducted in Hut 8, where the brilliant mathematician and cryptanalyst Alan Turing worked. Turing designed a machine that eventually worked to decode the Enigma machines faster, and in the process became one of the founders of computer science. Prime Minister Churchill and President Roosevelt conducted a significant meeting together in August of 1941 off the coast of Newfoundland. Although the United States was still not a combatant in World War II, the two leaders denounced Nazi aggression by issuing the Atlantic Charter. The unified statement announced the United States and United Kingdom sought no territorial gains, affirmed the right of peoples to self-determine their nations, advocated for free trade and free seas, pronounced their belief in freedom from fear and want, and advocated for disarmament of aggressive nations. The Charter was primarily an idealistic statement that could not be implemented as long as Hitler controlled large portions of Europe, but it did give the Allies the moral high ground and offered the formation of a vision for the post-war world that rejected Nazi militarism and would lay the basis of the United Nations and a new world order. Although the United States had repeatedly declared its neutrality since the beginning of the war, President Roosevelt did look for additional opportunities to keep Britain in the war and support their defense. The Lend-Lease Act, first passed by the Congress in 1941, was designed to give food, material, and munitions aid to Britain in their hour of need. There was little popular support among Americans to join the war effort even in late 1941, so even the name of the act was a shrewd act of Roosevelt's effort to subtly support the British. Roosevelt informed the American people that the United States was not entering the war, but rather lending or leasing, just letting England borrow ships, vehicles, weapons, and other munitions not being used by the United States. Presumably, the British would return the lent goods, which of course cannot really happen with discharged or damaged or expended military equipment. The Lend-Lease program did effectively keep England in the war, and gradually the program was expanded to additional allied nations. China, Australia, New Zealand, and India, and several nations in Africa and the Middle East, and eventually the Soviet Union, all received an abundance of aid through the Lend-Lease program. Agricultural products, shipping and industrial resources, raw materials, spare parts, oil, and of course tanks, jeeps, trucks, ships, and aircraft were also important elements in the Lend-Lease program. By the end of the war, a total of $50 billion in supplies would be shipped by the United States to its Allied partners. Stalled and stalemated during the Battle of Britain, Hitler made the errant choice of turning his attention away from defeating England and towards other battlefronts. Seeking additional territories to incorporate into the Third Reich, Hitler invaded and occupied additional neighboring countries. He occupied the entirety of Czechoslovakia, beyond the Sudetenland, in violation of the Munich Agreement. Hungary allied itself with Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy, and although occupied by the German army, was not invaded or suffered widespread destruction. Romania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia likewise allied themselves with Nazi Germany in a defensive alliance, probably recognizing their inability to resist a full-scale Nazi invasion. When a British-backed coup occurred in Yugoslavia which toppled its government, the new Yugoslav government renounced the alliance, angering Hitler and provoking a German invasion in the spring of 1941. Whereas the Italians initially attempted to invade Greece through occupied Albania, the Greeks heroically beat them back, marking the first Allied victory against the Axis powers in the war. Hitler, concerned about the vulnerability of his southern front, reluctantly dispatched troops to invade Greece, driving its government into exile and adding yet another historic state to the list of Nazi victories. In an effort to gain control of the Mediterranean as well as to threaten British holdings in Egypt, particularly the Suez Canal, Hitler also launched an invasion of North Africa. Particularly, he moved against Tunisia and Libya. The German campaign in North Africa was ably led by one of Hitler's most effective generals during the war. Erwin Rommel would become nicknamed the Desert Fox for his uncanny ability to attack unsuspecting units and then withdraw into the desert before his opponent could muster an effective counterattack. Although he had early concerns regarding Germany's ability to win the war, Rommel nevertheless effectively expanded German holdings across North Africa and would prove difficult for the Allies to dislodge. North Africa was quickly subdued by the Nazis and represented an additional continent and front to fight on as Nazi Germany continued its militant aggression. Hitler would make his first big mistake of the war by turning his attention away from Britain, even though it was not defeated. His second mistake would prove even more costly and catastrophic for his Third Reich. Hitler held a lifelong contempt for Slavs as an ethnic group, believing they were racially inferior. He had also catapulted his own career in opposition to communism in Germany. Thus, the Russian communists of the Soviet Union were an object of particular contempt for him, and he was determined to destroy the nation. Hitler had wisely secured his Eastern Front by signing the Non-Aggression Pact with the Soviet Union in 1939. Stalin believed Hitler would not break the pact, but as it turns out, the Non-Aggression Pact was simply to buy time to invade the West before Hitler turned his attention to the East. Against the better judgment of his general staff, Hitler pushed forward for Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Barbarossa invoked the name of a medieval German king who had participated in the Crusades. Hitler was convinced that the Soviet Union was a frail structure that would collapse the moment the invasion began. He envisioned seizing the western regions of the Soviet Union for Lebensraum, or living space for the German race, and that the native Slav and Jewish populations would be deported to Siberia or intentionally exterminated. Hitler believed seizing the agricultural regions of Ukraine and the oil fields of the Caucasus Mountains would only supplement the Nazi war effort and ensure its success. On June 22, 1941, 3 large German army groups plunged across the border into Soviet territory. For the most part, the Soviets were taken completely by surprise. One army group aimed north for Leningrad. The Middle Army Group headed due east with its objective being Moscow, the capital. The Third Army Group turned towards the south and headed towards the Caucasus Mountains. The German army, or Wehrmacht, moved with breakneck speed. Soviet villages, towns, and cities fell easily into German hands, and German armored columns actually outpaced their original projections for daily progress. Entire villages were intentionally slaughtered by the Nazis, and the indiscriminate killing seemed endless. Jews were casually surrendered to the Einsatzgruppen, or mobile killing units that traveled with the German army, and thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of Jews were purposefully murdered. Russian soldiers were captured by the millions, only to be subsequently shot or starved by the Nazis. Soviet Unions deployed antiquated tanks and vehicles against the superior armor of the Germans and endured predictable results. The entire general staff, which Stalin had purged in the previous decade, was now notably absent, as command structures broke down and inferior commanders who had replaced those who were purged struggled to muster a response to slow the Nazi advance. The Luftwaffe strafed and bombed one Russian city after another and held almost complete superiority of the air with little to no challenge from Soviet aircraft. Russian citizens resorted to a scorched earth policy of burning their own crops, killing their own livestock, and hiding their own supplies to deny the invading Germans any supplies or chance of living off the land as they moved deeper and deeper into the Soviet Union. The losses sustained by the Soviet army were staggering. Poorly commanded units were wiped out. Millions were taken as prisoners, suffering a fate at times even worse than dying quickly in combat. Scores of Russian guns, trucks, tanks, and ammunition were captured by the Germans, depriving the Soviets of any effective response to the invasion. The Northern Army Group moved almost without obstruction all the way to Leningrad, and rather than launch a full-scale urban assault, surrounded the city and lay siege to the former capital of Imperial Russia. The siege of Leningrad would last 2 years, 4 months, 2 weeks, and 5 days. There were only isolated and limited means to get in or out of the city, and thus to deliver supplies to the starving inhabitants. When Lake Ladoga was frozen, there were times Russian trucks could deliver a limited number of supplies to the besieged city by driving across the frozen sea. For the majority of the siege, however, the residents of Leningrad endured unparalleled hunger and deprivation. The city was shelled and bombed even as the citizens had little to keep them alive. When food supplies ran out, residents ate the horses. When the horses were consumed, they ate dogs and cats, then the rats, and then each other. Numerous cases of cannibalism occurred during the siege as residents of Leningrad were increasingly desperate for food. Leningraders would suffer the loss of well over 500,000 lives due to the siege and the hunger and squalor it engendered. The Central German Army Group moved rapidly during the early days of the operation towards the Soviet capital of Moscow. Stalin was completely stunned upon the news that Hitler had launched an invasion of the Soviet Union. He refused to believe Hitler would go back on his word from the non-aggression pact. Stalin remained almost frozen in a state for several days, immobilized from issuing commands even as his senior staff begged him for directions. The Germans fought their way across the Russian western plains, reaching Moscow in the autumn of 1941. Every resident of Moscow was summoned to war service. Old men, women, children, and even the sick were expected to contribute to the defense of Moscow. Barricades were erected at the entrances to the city. Women dug anti-tank ditches which were designed to obstruct, slow, and lodge a tank into a ditch to prevent further progress. The Germans could see the skyline of Moscow in the distance and got within a dozen miles of the city before finally being slowed and stopped. A third German army group plunged toward the south, across the Soviet Union, entering the Ukraine, and headed for the Caucasus Mountains. In the course of the army group's progress, the Nazis fixed their attention on a city in the south named Stalingrad after the Soviet leader. Taking the city of Stalingrad was not originally an objective of the army group, but the operation had gone so well and exceeded so many expectations thus far that the Germans became greedy and overconfident. Almost every other city had fallen rather easily, and a city that was named after the Soviet leader that the Führer despised seemed to be too great of a prize to bypass. Thus, the German troops, which had originally planned to move past Stalingrad and into the Caucasus, rerouted towards Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe immediately commenced bombing the city so extensively that it was quickly turned into rubble. Thereafter, German troops stormed the city and entered the bombed-out city, encountering heavy Russian resistance. The Luftwaffe's bombing of Stalingrad actually turned the city into an ideal fortress for defense, and now the German soldier faced a well-entrenched and angry enemy behind every broken down wall and around every shell of a building that remained in the city. German and Russian troops would fight each other, at times face to face and hand to hand, in the rubble of Stalingrad for the next 5 months. By late 1941, Axis domination of Europe was truly impressive. Parts of Scandinavia to the north, large sections of North Africa to the south, most of Western Europe, all of Eastern Europe, and deep within the Soviet Union was entirely under their control and occupation. By the winter of 1941, the prospects of defeating the Axis powers seemed far and remote, and most of Europe languished under Nazi control and oppression.